The most radical changes in human history did not arrive with banners, speeches, or revolutions. They arrived like dust settling, like stone wearing down underwater, so slowly that no single generation could point to a day and say, "This is when everything changed." And yet, if you look at the long arc of early civilization, you can find a transition so profound that it reshaped the human world without ever announcing itself. A transfer of authority, a quiet reorganization of reality, a moment when power moved from the heavens to human hands, and then more astonishing still, humanity forgot the transfer had ever occurred. Tonight, we trace that invisible path, not as a story of gods disappearing, but as a story of governance changing its address. We move through the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, through temple archives and king lists, through sacred ownership and bureaucratic invention, through the subtle evolution of language itself. We will look at the Anunnaki not as aliens or science fiction, but as a concept that functioned like the highest level of authority in an ancient operating system. A divine administrative council that owned land, appointed kings, issued decrees, and defined what legitimacy meant. And we will follow the slow, nearly accidental process by which human institutions learned to operate without constant divine management, until the gods remained everywhere in ritual yet nowhere in the actual mechanics of government. The question is not whether gods existed. The question is how a civilization behaves when it believes, with full seriousness, that it does not own itself, that it lives inside a world legally possessed by powers above it, that authority descends rather than rises, that laws are not invented but delivered, that kings do not lead by their own will but serve as temporary managers of an estate owned by the divine. To feel how total this worldview was, imagine waking in a city like Uruk, not in the modern imagination of dusty ruins and museum labels, but in its living reality around 3000 to 100 BCE. The city is not simply a settlement, it is a machine of coordination, an experiment in density, a place where thousands of people live beside strangers and must still eat, work, trade, worship, and survive. Canals must be maintained. Surplus must be stored. Disputes must be resolved. Rations must be distributed. Work must be organized. And all of this must happen in a world where the most fundamental question, who has the right to command, is not debated in human terms. Because in the earliest Mesopotamian imagination, the answer is already settled. The rightful owners are the gods. In this world, a temple is not a church in the modern sense. It is not primarily a gathering place for believers. It is a house, a literal residence, a divine estate. The god lives there, and the city exists around that fact. The temple's storerooms are not symbolic. They are the economic heart of the city. Grain, oil, wool, livestock resources flow into the temple because they are owed to the divine owner, and then flow back out as rations because the divine household must function and its dependence must be maintained. Priests are not only ritual specialists, they are administrators. Scribes are not merely writers, they are accountants of a sacred economy. Workers do not simply labor, they maintain the property of a higher authority. When you read the earliest clay tablets, those dense, practical records of rations, herds, fields, deliveries, inventories, you can feel this structure embedded in the most mundane details. The tablets do not read like myths. They read like bureaucracy. Numbers, lists, measures, names, dates. Everything counted. Everything recorded. And behind it all, a quiet assumption. These resources belong to the divine household. People manage them. People work them. But ownership rests above. This is where a modern reader can misunderstand the ancient world. We tend to imagine religion as separate from practical governance, as belief layered on top of economics, as metaphors spoken alongside real administration. In early Mesopotamia, the separation does not exist. The divine is not a private spiritual realm. It is the central framework through which practical life is organized. The gods are not distant abstractions. They are legal realities. Their names appear in contracts. Their houses dominate city plans. Their property is measured and defended. Their favor explains prosperity. Their withdrawal explains collapse. Divine authority is not decoration. It is infrastructure. And at the top of this infrastructure sits an idea that appears again and again in early texts. Kingship descends from heaven. One of the most famous expressions of this appears in the Sumerian king list, a document compiled in the early 2nd millennium BC but drawing on older traditions. It begins with a simple, foundational claim. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. The phrasing is not poetic in the way modern myths feel poetic. It is administrative. It is declarative. Kingship is treated like a transferable institution, a kind of cosmic office that can be placed in one city and then moved to another. It is not invented by humans. It is not seized by conquest. It is delivered, granted, withdrawn, reassigned. And the king list repeats a rhythm with mechanical precision. Kingship was in this city. That city was defeated. Kingship was taken to another city. Again and again, through centuries, through names and dynasties, through rise and fall. The meaning is clear. Legitimate power does not belong to the people. It does not even belong to the king. It belongs to a higher authority that decides where legitimacy rests. That higher authority is often described in the language of divine assembly, a council of gods who issue decrees and determine fates. And among the terms that emerge in this environment is the category we call the Anunnaki. Not a fixed cast of characters with consistent roles across every time and place, but a concept, a class of divine authorities associated with decision, decree, and the setting of outcomes. In some texts they are judges. In others they are linked to the underworld. In some they are numbered. In others they are indistinct. The variability is not a flaw. It reflects how living religious systems adapt across centuries. But one element remains stable. The Anunnaki represent the tier of authority where reality is decided. In modern terms, it is almost as if early civilization imagines governance as layered. At the highest level is the cosmic legislature, the divine council that defines the parameters of order. Beneath it are institutions that execute those parameters. Temples, scribal offices, courts, storehouses, work crews. Beneath those are human lives lived inside a structure they did not create. This worldview solves real problems. Without theories of popular sovereignty, without constitutions, without elections, without a conceptual language that says legitimacy can arise from collective human choice. How do you explain why one dynasty falls and another rises? Why one city dominates and another collapses? Why military strength fails to secure permanence? Divine legitimacy creates a standard that is absolute in origin but conditional in application. Power is sacred, therefore unquestionable in principle, but rulers can still be criticized as failing to fulfill the divine mandate. The system can condemn a king without condemning kingship itself. This is why divine governance is not merely superstition. It is political theology. It is an operating system for complex society. But operating systems can evolve. Not through dramatic announcements, but through patches, workarounds, and gradual shifts in what is actually required to keep daily life functioning. And here we reach one of the most revealing texts of Mesopotamia, the Atrahasis epic. In this story, the gods themselves face a crisis. They are burdened by labor. Lower gods dig canals, maintain riverbeds, perform the work required to sustain cosmic order. They revolt. They burn their tools. They surround the house of the chief god and refuse to continue. The divine assembly convenes. A solution is proposed. Create a substitute labor force. Create humans. In Atrahasis, the purpose of humanity is blunt. Humans are made to work, to relieve the gods of labor, to maintain the divine estate, to keep the world running so the higher authorities do not have to carry the physical burden. The method is disturbing to modern sensibilities. A god is sacrificed, his flesh and blood mixed with clay, creating beings that carry a fragment of divine intelligence while remaining mortal, limited, controllable. This story is not a moral ideal. It is a window into how early Mesopotamia understood the relationship between divine authority and human function. People exist inside the divine economy as workers. The temple system described in administrative tablets is, in a sense, the institutional counterpart of this cosmic narrative. Human life supports the divine household. That is the structure. And yet, the epic also contains a tension that will echo through later history. Humans multiply. They grow numerous. They become noisy, difficult to manage. The gods respond with disasters. Plague, drought, famine. Humans recover. Finally, the gods decide on a flood. Total reset. Again, a divine administrative correction. But read the story a little differently, and you see something else. Once humans exist, once they develop complexity, they become harder to control through direct divine management. The system that worked for a smaller, simpler workforce becomes unstable when the workforce grows, adapts, and develops institutions. The old order strains under the weight of human capacity. This is the quiet pressure that builds beneath the surface of the sacred economy. The more complex human society becomes, the more it requires stable procedures that do not depend entirely on interpreting divine mood through disaster and success. If every drought is a divine verdict, if every defeat means the gods have withdrawn support, then legitimacy becomes dangerously fragile. A single catastrophe can undermine the entire psychological foundation of governance. People interpret failure as abandonment. Morale collapses. Institutions destabilize. The interpretation creates a feedback loop that accelerates collapse rather than preventing it. So early civilizations develop coping strategies. Lavish temple building, precise ritual calendars, constant offerings, public demonstrations of piety. Kings present themselves as scrupulous servants of the gods. Priests refine procedures. Scribes record everything. But none of this guarantees stability because the fundamental structure remains. Legitimacy is read from outcomes, and outcomes are never fully controllable. What this system needs, what it quietly begins to generate, is a form of authority that can survive bad outcomes without collapsing into cosmic abandonment. A standard of order that can remain stable even when harvests fail, even when enemies attack, even when disasters strike. And this is where writing becomes more than record-keeping. It becomes a technology of permanence, a way of fixing standards outside the shifting realm of interpretation. At first, writing belongs to the temple. It exists to track offerings, rations, land, labor. But as bureaucracy expands, writing becomes a tool that can outgrow its sacred origin. It can serve palace administration as well as temple economy. It can coordinate human institutions without requiring constant direct divine instruction. And the moment that law always considered sacred begins to be written publicly, the nature of authority begins to change. This change is easy to miss because the language stays the same. Kings still claim divine appointment. They still invoke the gods. They still present themselves as chosen. The heavens still appear in prologues and inscriptions. But beneath the language, the mechanism shifts. One of the clearest artifacts of this shift is the famous Stele of Hammurabi, carved in black diorite around 1750 BCE. At the top, a relief shows the king standing before Shamash, the divine judge, receiving symbols of authority. The visual message is traditional. The law comes from the gods. The king is their agent. But below that image are hundreds of law-specific, practical regulations dealing with property disputes, contracts, theft, assault, inheritance, marriage, divorce, professional negligence. The laws specify punishments, compensation, procedures. They define standards that will outlive any single ruler. This is the pivotal move. Not because Hammurabi invented human law, but because the public, permanent inscription of law creates a new structure of governance. Once law exists as a visible, durable text, it becomes a standard that can be consulted, taught, enforced. It is no longer only a living interpretation delivered through priests and omens. It becomes an institution, and institutions can function without constant divine management. This is the quiet transfer of power, not a revolution, not a declaration, a functional shift in who operates the machinery of order. The gods remain the source of legitimacy, but the daily work of governance, courts, contracts, enforcement, administration becomes unmistakably human. The divine becomes the seal at the top, the authorization stamp. The human becomes the engine. This arrangement is brilliant because it satisfies both the old worldview and the new needs. It preserves the sacred origin of power while allowing human systems to do the heavy lifting. It keeps cosmic order intact while creating practical stability. The gods are still honored, still real, still central, but they are no longer required to micromanage every outcome. They can bless, approve, legitimate. Humans can decide, execute, administer. Over centuries, this pattern deepens. Temples remain powerful institutions. Festivals continue. Priests maintain precise rituals. Divine statues are paraded through streets. Offerings continue. People pray, seek omens, interpret dreams. The sacred remains woven into the fabric of life. This is not modern secularization. It is something subtler. The gods do not vanish. They change roles. They retreat from administration into ceremony. They become witnesses rather than operators, approvers rather than managers. And you can see this shift in the way kings speak about themselves. Early rulers present themselves primarily as executors of divine command. Later rulers still mention the gods, but their language begins to reveal initiative. They build temples in honor of the gods, yes, but they also describe their own plans. They wage campaigns with divine blessing, yes, but they also emphasize strategy, decision, ambition. The gods grant success, but the king acts. Even foreign conquerors can adopt the divine language to legitimize their rule, as if the sacred vocabulary has become a political technology. When Cyrus conquers Babylon in 539 BCE, he presents himself as chosen by Marduk to restore order. The language remains. But by this point, the divine choice functions more as retroactive justification than as a literal administrative appointment. Heaven's approval becomes a story told to explain power already taken. This is the final stage of the quiet transfer. The gods remain in speech, in ritual, in identity. But the location of actual decision-making courts, bureaucracies, armies, taxation, law rests in human institutions. And the most remarkable consequence is psychological. Because as centuries pass, the memory of the transition itself fades. Later generations inherit a world where humans rule and assume it has always been so. The age when divine authority legally owned the land and appointed kings becomes myth, epic, symbolic time. The old structure survives as story, not as lived governance. Myth becomes a museum of former realities. This is what cultures do when they undergo transformations too gradual to commemorate. They archive the old order in narratives. They preserve it as sacred memory. They continue to tell stories about gods who once ruled, not because the stories are childish, but because they hold a record of how the world once felt, how legitimacy once worked, how authority once flowed. When the world changed, no one threw a party. No one declared independence from heaven. The transition happened in offices, in storehouses, in courtrooms, in the slow standardization of procedure. It happened as scribes wrote more than inventories, as kings carved law into stone, as bureaucracies became capable of maintaining order even when divine certainty felt unstable. It happened as the need for functional stability quietly overpowered the old model of interpreting every event as cosmic verdict. Humanity did not defeat the gods. It institutionalized them. It absorbed divine authority into systems that could function without it. And because the shift was so gradual, it could be forgotten. Now imagine one evening in Babylon, late in the first millennium BCE. The ziggurat rises against a darkening sky. The bricks hold centuries of ritual memory. Inside the temple, priests make offerings with precision inherited from generations. Lamps flicker before statues. Incense drifts through corridors. The house of the gods still stands. It still feels central. It still shapes identity. But outside the temple walls, the city moves under a different logic. Disputes are settled through human courts applying written standards. Administrators manage resources through procedures. Soldiers obey commands issued by human rulers. Taxes are collected by officials. Contracts are enforced by institutions. Decisions are made in palaces, not in divine assemblies. The gods still bless. They still matter. They still exist within the imagination of the culture. But the machinery of the world turns on human hands. And here is the quiet truth that makes this story so unsettling and so deeply human. The greatest transfer of power in history may not have been from one empire to another, but from a worldview in which authority was external and cosmic, to a world in which authority became internal and institutional. The moment humans began to govern themselves not by rejecting the sacred, but by building systems that made direct divine management unnecessary. The story is not about disbelief. It is about capability. Once humans learned to coordinate at scale through writing, accounting, law, bureaucracy, they created a parallel structure to the sacred economy. A structure that could keep order through procedure rather than through constant interpretation of divine mood. And once that structure existed, it grew quietly, like a root system beneath a forest floor, until one day the surface looked the same as temples, rituals, divine language, but the nutrients were flowing through human channels. This is why the shift is almost invisible if you only look at the surface. Because the surface remained sacred, the deeper layer changed. And if you want to understand how power truly moves, it is almost always like this. Not through dramatic declarations, but through changes in who holds the tools that make the world function. Who holds the ledger? Who writes the standard? Who enforces the contract? Who keeps the archives? Who defines what is normal? Because whoever defines normal does not need to shout. They rule by default. So the slow transformation of early Mesopotamia is not only ancient history, it is a lesson in how authority can migrate without being noticed. How systems can outgrow their founding stories while still repeating them. How people can inherit a world and assume it has always been this way. And now, as the night grows quieter, we can let the paradox settle without forcing it into a modern judgment. The people of early Mesopotamia were not naive. They built cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, organized labor, created contracts. They were capable of astonishing complexity, and yet they lived within a conceptual universe where legitimacy came from above, where the land belonged to gods, where kingship descended. Then, without declaring war on heaven, they slowly built the administrative foundations of human rule. They created permanence. They created procedure. They created law in stone. They created institutions that could function when divine favor felt uncertain. And in doing so, they did what humans so often do. They adapted. At first, adaptation looks like devotion. It looks like keeping the old language while changing the underlying structure. It looks like claiming divine appointment while writing your own laws. It looks like honoring the gods while moving the center of decision-making into human hands. It looks like continuity. But under continuity, it is transformation. And transformation, when it is slow enough, becomes invisible. It becomes the kind of change you only notice in retrospect when you compare the earliest tablets to the later stelae, when you compare a temple-owned economy to a palace-administered state, when you compare decrees issued by divine councils to laws carved by kings. This is the archaeology of power, not the archaeology of ruins, but of assumptions. And the deepest assumption that changed was this: who owns the world? In the earliest system, the world is owned by the divine, and humans maintain it. In the later system, humans become the operators of the world while still speaking as if the divine remains the owner. Eventually, even that speech becomes a heritage rather than a live structure. And that is how humanity took control and forgot it ever happened. Now, in the calm of this moment, you can allow the story to soften. You don't have to hold every detail. You don't have to solve the question of what gods really were. You only have to feel the shape of the transition. A world once governed as sacred property slowly becoming a world governed as human institution. Heaven remaining in ritual while the earth became human responsibility. The lamps in the temple continue to flicker. The smoke continues to rise. The old songs continue to be sung. But outside, the city breathes under human law. And that is the quiet ending of divine government, not an extinction, but a relocation. Not a fall, but a transformation. Not a revolution, but an inheritance. And as the last thought settles, the mind can relax into the oldest human skill of all. Letting stories fade into silence, letting meaning remain without force, letting the night do what it has always done, turn complexity into calm. Because once authority settles into institutions, once legitimacy is carried by procedure rather than presence, power acquires a new character. It no longer needs to explain itself constantly. It no longer needs to prove its origin through spectacle or catastrophe. It simply functions. And when power functions quietly, it becomes harder to notice, harder to question, harder to remember as something that ever arrived at all. This is why later generations could inherit a fully human system of governance while still speaking the language of divine rule. The words remained because they were useful. They carried weight. They linked the present to a sacred past. But the engine had changed. The gears turned without waiting for omens. The courts ruled without consulting the stars. The scribes recorded outcomes rather than revelations. And over time, the memory of dependency faded. What replaced it was not arrogance, but familiarity. When something works long enough, people stop asking why it works. They stop asking where it came from. They stop imagining alternatives. Human rule became normal. And normality is the most powerful form of legitimacy there is. If you step back far enough, you can see this pattern repeating again and again across history. Systems born as sacred truths slowly harden into institutions. Institutions accumulate procedures. Procedures become habits. Habits become expectations. And expectations eventually feel like nature itself. This is how authority hides. Not by force, but by time. In Mesopotamia, this process unfolded across millennia. Not evenly, not smoothly, There were reversals, crises, revivals of older language, moments when kings leaned heavily on divine rhetoric to stabilize shaky rule. But the overall direction held. Human systems became more capable, more resilient, more self-sustaining, and each improvement reduced the need for constant divine explanation. This does not mean belief vanished. Far from it. People continued to pray, to sacrifice, to interpret dreams, to fear divine displeasure. The sacred remained emotionally real. But emotional reality and administrative reality are not the same thing. One governs meaning, the other governs outcomes. And outcomes increasingly depended on human decisions. By the time empires expanded beyond city-states, by the time territories stretched across regions, languages, and cultures, the idea of a constantly intervening divine administration became impractical. No cosmic council could realistically be consulted for every tax, every military supply route, every provincial dispute. Empires required delegation, standardization, predictability. They required something closer to systems engineering than ritual interpretation. So the divine moved upward, abstracted, elevated. Gods became guarantors of order rather than its daily managers. They sanctioned the system rather than running it. Their presence was invoked at the beginning of reigns, at the founding of laws, at moments of renewal, but not at every operational step. This abstraction was not a loss of faith. It was a redistribution of responsibility. And responsibility, once assumed, rarely returns to where it came from. Think again of the earliest temple economies, where every field, every flock, every workshop belonged to a god. Contrast that with later legal systems where land could be privately owned, contracts enforced by courts, disputes resolved through written law. The transition does not require a declaration. It requires only repetition. Enough cases resolved by human judges. Enough disputes settled without recourse to omen. Enough years where the world continues to function. At some point, people stop expecting the heavens to intervene. They still hope. They still pray. But they plan as if no intervention is guaranteed. And planning is the seed of autonomy. This is why the shift from divine rule to human governance is best understood not as a philosophical revolution, but as a practical one. It did not begin with new ideas about freedom or sovereignty. It began with the need to make things work. To keep grain moving. To keep canals clear. To keep peace among strangers. To survive complexity. Ideas followed function. Once writing could preserve law, once institutions could enforce it, once authority could persist beyond the lifespan of a single ruler, the world entered a new phase. Power became something that could be inherited by systems rather than by individuals. Legitimacy could be maintained even when leaders failed. Order could survive incompetence. That alone marks a profound transformation. Divine systems are powerful, but they are brittle. They interpret success as favor and failure as abandonment. Human systems, once mature, can tolerate failure. They can correct, adapt, revise. They can attribute loss to error rather than due. This flexibility is what allowed human governance to outlast divine administration. And yet, the memory of divine ownership lingered because it had shaped identity for so long. Cultures do not erase their foundations. They ritualize them. They turn them into stories. They keep them alive as symbols, as warnings, as explanations for why the world feels ordered at all. Myth, in this sense, is not falsehood. It is archival memory. It preserves earlier versions of reality in narrative form. It tells future generations how things once worked, even if those generations no longer live inside the same structure. When later societies told stories of gods who ruled the world directly, they were not fantasizing. They were remembering imperfectly, symbolically, but sincerely. And memory, once mythologized, becomes timeless. This is why the Anunnaki never disappear. They recede. They become less precise, less administrative, more symbolic. They are no longer encountered in account ledgers, but in epics. No longer cited in contracts, but in cosmologies. Their role shifts from deciding outcomes to explaining origins, from issuing decrees to embodying principles. And principles are easier to keep than systems. The same happens to kingship itself. Once kings ruled as divine appointees managing sacred estates. Later, kings rule as human sovereigns justified by divine favor. Eventually, even that justification becomes ceremonial. The crown remains sacred in language long after its power becomes secular in practice. The past lingers as costume. This is not deception. It is continuity. Humans rarely abandon the stories that carried them through earlier ages. They repurpose them. They translate them. They let them drift into metaphor. In doing so, they preserve meaning while changing function. And this may be the most human act of all. Because what this long Mesopotamian transition reveals is not a simple narrative of progress or decline, belief or disbelief. It reveals adaptability. It reveals how humans respond when old explanations strain under new conditions. They do not shatter the old world. They build alongside it. They create parallel structures until the old one no longer carries the load. Only then does the center shift. And when it shifts slowly enough, it leaves no scar. No battlefield marks the end of divine administration. No proclamation announces the birth of human sovereignty. The change happens in quiet rooms, in clay tablets, in stone inscriptions, in procedures refined over generations. It happens while everyone is busy living. Which is why, by the time the transition is complete, it no longer feels like a transition at all. It feels like the way things have always been. And now, as the night deepens, you can let this pattern dissolve into a broader understanding. Not as a lesson to memorize, but as a rhythm to recognize. The world changes most profoundly when it changes without spectacle. When structures evolve beneath familiar language. When responsibility migrates quietly. Civilizations are not only built, they are inherited. And inheritance often comes without explanation. So let the ancient cities fade back into darkness. Let the temples stand in memory, their lamps still burning, their rituals still echoing. Let the laws remain carved in stone, surviving the hands that shaped them. And let the thought rest gently, without urgency, that the greatest shifts in human history do not announce themselves. They simply arrive. And long after they have settled, long after they have shaped the world we live in, we look back not to witness the moment of change, but to realize that it already happened. And that realization, once reached, no longer needs to be held. It can be released into sleep. And when the thought finally releases its grip, what remains is not a conclusion, but a widening. Because once you recognize how quietly authority can move, you begin to sense how many other transformations have unfolded in the same way without banners, without witnesses, without memory. Human history, at its deepest level, is not a sequence of loud events, but a layering of habits that slowly replace one another until the older layer becomes invisible beneath the new. In the earliest Mesopotamian world, divine ownership was not a metaphor. It structured labor, law, economy, and meaning. Yet over time, humans learned to perform every necessary function of that system themselves. They coordinated labor. They stored surplus. They resolved disputes. They enforced standards. And with each generation, these skills became less remarkable and more expected. Expectation is a quiet teacher. When children grow up inside a functioning system, they do not ask who invented it. They do not wonder whether it could be otherwise. They learn how to operate within it, not how it came to be. In this way, institutional memory replaces historical memory. The system remembers, even when people do not. This is why later cultures could sincerely believe in divine authority while living entirely under human governance. The belief did not contradict experience because experience had been shaped to fit belief. Ritual confirmed legitimacy. Language preserved sacred origin. But daily life moved according to human rules. The sacred had become a frame rather than a mechanism. And frames are powerful. They shape perception without requiring constant intervention. They tell people how to interpret success and failure, revealing meaning without directing action. In this role, the divine became something even more subtle than an administrator. It became a justification for order itself. Once this happens, authority no longer needs to descend. It only needs to be acknowledged. The practical implications of this shift ripple outward across centuries. Legal systems become increasingly standardized. Administrative roles become professionalized. Scribes, judges, tax collectors, military officers, human specialists emerge as the true operators of power. Kings still speak the language of heaven, but their effectiveness depends on earthly competence. And competence, once recognized, becomes a source of legitimacy in its own right. This is where the story leaves the realm of ancient Mesopotamia and becomes a universal pattern. Wherever complex societies form, the same dynamic appears. Sacred origin legitimizes authority. Human systems operationalize it. Over time, the operation matters more than the origin. The origin remains in ceremony. The operation becomes reality. And eventually, Even ceremony becomes optional. But the transition always begins the same way. Not with disbelief, but with redundancy. When a system can function without direct intervention, intervention becomes unnecessary. When unnecessary, it becomes symbolic. When symbolic, it becomes memory. Memory softens. Softened memory becomes story. And story becomes sleep. This is why the earliest myths do not read like fantasy to those who lived within their world. They read like explanations. They explain why power works the way it does. They explain why cities rise and fall. They explain why authority is obeyed even when it fails. They explain why suffering can coexist with order. Later, when the explanations are no longer needed for daily function, they survive as culture, as identity, as meaning, as narrative. The gods do not die. They retire. And retirement is not disappearance. It is relocation from the center of operations to the edge of memory. In that edge, they remain potent. They remind humans that order was once fragile, that legitimacy was once external, that the world was once owned by something other than itself. They serve as a warning and a comfort at the same time. A warning that power can be lost. A comfort that order has deeper roots than any single ruler. This dual role is why divine language persists long after divine administration ends. It anchors authority to something beyond immediate circumstance. Even when humans govern themselves, they prefer to believe that order has a deeper justification than convenience. But the machinery keeps running regardless. And so, as centuries pass, what began as divine ownership becomes human stewardship, then human control, then human assumption, and finally, human forgetting. Forgetting is not ignorance. It is absorption. When a system becomes fully integrated into life, it no longer feels like a system. It feels like reality. And reality is rarely questioned until it breaks. This is the quiet irony of the human takeover of governance. By succeeding so thoroughly, it erased its own origin story. The moment humans became capable of ruling themselves, the question of whether they should cease to matter. And yet, traces remain. They remain in language, in ritual, in architecture, in the deep structure of law, in the instinct to look upward towards something higher when systems fail, in the lingering sense that authority must be justified by more than force. These traces are not relics. They are fossils of earlier operating systems embedded in cultural memory. And fossils tell stories, not of extinction, but of transformation. As the night continues, you can let this realization drift without tension. You do not need to judge the past by modern standards. You do not need to decide whether divine rule was true or false. You only need to observe the pattern. How humans adapt, how systems evolve, how responsibility shifts. Because the story of divine governance becoming human administration is not about loss of faith. It is about the expansion of capacity, the slow discovery that humans could carry the weight of order themselves. And once that weight was lifted, it never fully returned to the heavens. The gods remained as witnesses. The laws remained as anchors. The institutions remained as engines. And humanity moved forward, unaware of the exact moment it took the reins. That unawareness is not failure. It is continuity. And continuity is what allows sleep to arrive without disturbance. So let the ancient councils dissolve into distance. Let the tablets rest beneath the soil. Let the stone laws stand quietly, long after their authors are gone. Let the rituals echo softly in memory. The world continues. And the mind, recognizing the rhythm, can rest. No revolution needed. No ending required. Only the slow, steady settling of understanding into silence. And in that silence, one final layer becomes visible not as an argument, not as a revelation, but as a feeling that has always been there beneath the surface of human history. Because when authority no longer descends, when it no longer arrives from elsewhere, it leaves behind a subtle psychological echo, a space where certainty once lived, a gap where explanation once flowed effortlessly from heaven to earth. Early civilizations did not struggle with uncertainty the way later ones would. When drought came, the answer existed. When cities fell, the reason was known. When kings failed, the cause was already written into the structure of the world. Divine governance absorbed ambiguity. It transformed chaos into judgment, randomness into decision, suffering into verdict. When humans quietly inherited the machinery of power, they also inherited something heavier: responsibility without guarantee. At first, this weight was disguised. Divine language remained. Rituals continued. Kings still spoke as if guided. The heavens were still invoked. But gradually, outcomes depended less on cosmic interpretation and more on planning, administration, foresight, and error. Failure could no longer always be explained away as divine withdrawal. Sometimes, it was simply miscalculation. This realization did not arrive as philosophy. It arrived as anxiety. You can sense it in later texts, in prayers that sound less confident, in rituals that grow more elaborate, in omens consulted more obsessively, in laws written more carefully, as if precision itself might replace certainty. Humanity was learning to live in a world where order existed, but was no longer guaranteed by a watching authority. And so something curious happened. The gods became quieter, but human conscience grew louder. When power rested entirely with the divine, morality was obedience. Justice was alignment with decree. Right action meant fulfilling assigned roles. But once humans operated the system, morality began to shift inward. Decisions had consequences traceable to human hands. Laws were enforced by people. Punishments were chosen. Responsibility could no longer be fully externalized. This is not the birth of modern ethics, but it is the seed. Because when humans govern, even under divine banners, they begin to recognize themselves in the outcomes. They see their own fingerprints on success and failure. Over time, this recognition reshapes how societies think about blame, duty, fairness, and legitimacy. Not quickly, not consciously, but inevitably. The ancient world did not suddenly discover individual freedom or human rights. Those ideas would take thousands of years to form. But the groundwork was laid the moment authority stopped intervening directly and began authorizing indirectly. The moment humans stopped waiting for commands and started interpreting principles. Interpretation is where responsibility lives. And responsibility, once assumed, changes how power feels. This is why later civilizations could feel simultaneously more autonomous and more fragile, more capable, yet more uncertain. Without constant divine arbitration, humans had to tolerate ambiguity. They had to decide without knowing whether their choice aligned with cosmic will. They had to act first and interpret later. The world became quieter, but also heavier. And yet, people adapted. They always do. They built philosophies to replace certainty. They built traditions to replace command. They built institutions to replace decree. They built memory to replace presence. The sacred did not vanish, it transformed into meaning rather than management. And meaning, unlike management, does not require constant intervention. This is the deepest legacy of divine rule. Not the gods themselves, but the idea that order must mean something. That authority must be justified. That power should be more than force. Even when humans rule entirely on their own terms, they still search for something beyond efficiency to legitimize their systems. This instinct does not come from modern theory. It comes from deep time, from thousands of years living inside a world where power always pointed upward. So even now, long after the administrative gods have faded into myth, the human mind still looks for higher grounding. Not because it must, but because it remembers. Memory does not always speak in words. Sometimes it speaks in habits, in expectations, in the quiet discomfort we feel when authority seems arbitrary, in the relief we feel when rules appear stable, in the unease that arises when systems fail without explanation. These reactions are not accidents. They are inherited responses to an ancient structure that once organized reality itself. And this is why the transition we have traced tonight matters not as history to memorize, but as a lens through which to feel the present. Because the world we live in now is still shaped by that first quiet takeover, by the moment when humans learned to carry order themselves. Every law written, every institution built, every system maintained without invoking heaven, all of it echoes that ancient shift. And yet, the gods remain softly, in language, in ritual, in stories told before sleep, not as rulers, but as reminders. Reminders that power was once external, that legitimacy was once given, not made, that the world once belonged to something else, and reminders that humans, slowly and carefully, learn to live without that certainty. As the night settles, you do not need to resolve this tension. You do not need to choose between belief and disbelief, sacred and secular, past and present. You can let the story exist as what it is, a record of adaptation. The greatest transformations do not shout. They whisper. They change what is possible. They change what feels normal. And then they disappear into the background of life. So let the ancient cities sleep. Let the temples stand quietly in memory. Let the laws rest in stone. Let the councils dissolve into story. The world continues, held not by decree, but by habit. Not by heaven, but by hands. And in recognizing this, the mind does not need to stay awake. It can rest, because nothing more needs to happen. The transfer is complete. The silence remains. And sleep, as it always has, arrives not with force but with understanding. And with that understanding resting quietly beneath the surface, the story does not end. It simply widens further, moving beyond the moment of transfer and into the long afterlife of what was left behind. Because when a system fades without collapsing, it leaves residues, patterns of thought, reflexes of interpretation, ways of explaining the world that persist long after their original function has disappeared. Divine governance did not vanish when humans assumed control. It dissolved into the background of culture, into language, into instinct. Even as human institutions matured, people continued to experience the world through categories shaped by the sacred past. Success still felt like blessing. Failure still felt like judgment. Catastrophe still demanded meaning. And meaning, once supplied by divine decree, now had to be constructed. This construction was slow and uneven. At times, societies leaned back toward older explanations, especially during periods of instability. When plagues spread, when empires fractured, when famine returned, the ancient reflex resurfaced. Surely something higher had turned away. Surely order had been offended. Surely the fault lay beyond human error. These moments were not regressions. They were echoes. Because the human mind had been trained for millennia to interpret disorder as verdict. And untraining that reflex takes longer than changing institutions. This is why, even as legal systems became more elaborate, even as administration grew more precise, even as governance became fully human in operation, the language of fate never disappeared. Destiny, fortune, providence, these concepts filled the psychological space once occupied by divine management. They softened responsibility. They preserved mystery. They offered relief from total accountability. Humans had learned to rule, but they had not learned to rule without explanation. And explanation has always been as important as control. This is where philosophy begins to emerge not as abstract speculation, but as a response to the absence of guaranteed meaning. When the gods no longer issued daily instructions, humans began to ask different questions. What is justice, if not decree? What is order, if not command? What is legitimacy, if not descent from heaven? These questions did not arise overnight. They accumulated quietly, much like the bureaucratic changes that preceded them. Each generation added small adjustments. Each thinker reframed old assumptions. Each tradition layered interpretation upon inheritance. What emerged was not a rejection of the sacred, but a reinterpretation of it. Divinity became principle rather than administrator. Law became reasoned rather than revealed. Authority became conditional rather than absolute. But conditional authority is fragile. It requires trust, and trust requires continuity. So societies clung to rituals, not because they still governed, but because they stabilized. They reminded people that order had roots, that the world was not arbitrary, that something enduring lay beneath the surface of change. In this sense, ritual became emotional infrastructure. It carried what institutions could not. And as centuries passed, the memory of divine ownership transformed into a deep cultural intuition. That power should feel legitimate, not merely effective. That authority should appear justified, not merely enforced. That law should feel grounded in something larger than convenience. These intuitions are ancient, older than constitutions, older than states. They are the psychological inheritance of a world once governed from above. Even now, long after divine counsels cease to operate, people instinctively question power that feels unmoored. They resist authority that lacks narrative. They distrust systems that cannot explain themselves. This is not nostalgia, it is inheritance. The early Mesopotamian world taught humanity that legitimacy matters more than strength. That power without meaning collapses inward. That order must be believed in to function. When divine governance provided that belief, societies were stable even when unjust. When human governance replaced it, societies became flexible but also exposed. This exposure forced innovation. Written law was one response, public procedure was another. Institutional continuity was a third. Together, they formed a new foundation for legitimacy, one that did not rely on constant divine presence, but could still invoke sacred origin when needed. Over time, this balance shifted further. Sacred origin became tradition. Tradition became culture. Culture became background. And background became invisible. That invisibility is the final stage of successful transformation. When a system no longer needs to announce itself, it has won. By the time the ancient world gave way to classical civilizations, the administrative gods had fully retreated into mythic space. They lived in stories, in cosmologies, in epic memory. They shaped identity, but not policy. They explained beginnings, but not budgets. They ruled origins, not outcomes. And yet, their shadow remained. It remained in the structure of law codes that claimed timelessness, in the thought that justice should be impartial, like a divine decree, in the belief that rulers answer to something beyond themselves, even if that something is abstract. These ideas did not vanish with temples. They migrated. They became principles. Principles, unlike gods, do not need houses. They live in expectations. And expectations govern behavior more reliably than fear. This is why the story of divine governance becoming human administration is not a closed chapter. It is a foundation. It explains why humans continue to search for legitimacy beyond power, for meaning beyond efficiency, for order beyond survival. It explains why every new system eventually wraps itself in language that sounds older than it is. Why revolutions invent traditions. Why laws claim universality. Why authority seeks moral grounding. Because long ago, authority truly did come from elsewhere. And memory does not disappear simply because function changes. As the last stretch of this story settles, the pace can soften even further. There is nothing left to prove. Nothing left to explain. Only a pattern to feel. Civilization did not awaken one morning to find itself free from the gods. It slowly learned to live without their instructions. It learned to record rather than receive, to administer rather than interpret, to decide rather than wait. And in doing so, it accepted a quieter world. A world where order must be maintained. A world where mistakes belong to humans. A world where responsibility cannot be returned. This is the true inheritance of the ancient transition, not control, but burden. And yet, humans carried it. They still do. Every system you know, every rule you follow, every institution that shapes your life is part of that long, unbroken chain of adaptation. None of it appeared fully formed. None of it announced itself as final. It simply accumulated, just as this story has. And now, as the final thoughts drift into stillness, you do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to hold the names, the dates, the places. You only need to sense the movement from above to within, from decree to habit, from command to continuity. The gods ruled. Then they authorized. Then they witnessed. Then they remained as memory. And humans, without ceremony, took over the work of holding the world together. Not triumphantly, not rebelliously, but patiently, quietly, enough to fall asleep to. And as the final stretch of time opens gently before us, the story no longer needs to move forward. It only needs to settle. Because by now, everything essential has already happened. The transfer has taken place. The institutions stand. The rituals remain. The memory lingers. What is left is not change, but endurance, the long explanation of how a world continues once responsibility has fully arrived in human hands. After divine governance faded into ceremony, humanity did not become suddenly confident. It became careful. Systems were reinforced. Procedures repeated. Records preserved. Archives protected. The fear was no longer that the gods might withdraw their favor, but that disorder might emerge from within. And so societies learned to value predictability. They learned to preserve precedent. They learned to trust repetition more than inspiration. This is the true character of mature civilization. Not creativity alone, but maintenance. Not revelation, but continuity. Once humans assumed the role of caretakers of order, they discovered that order is fragile not because it lacks meaning, but because it requires attention. Without constant upkeep, systems decay. Without shared belief, institutions hollow out. Without memory, legitimacy dissolves. So memory became sacred in a new way, not as myth alone, but as record. Archives replaced omens. History replaced prophecy. Documentation replaced revelation. The past became the source of guidance, not because it was divine, but because it was stable. And stability, after uncertainty, feels almost holy. This is why later civilizations became obsessed with their origins. Why they traced lineages. Why they preserved chronicles. Why they carved inscriptions declaring continuity with ancient authority. Why they spoke of golden ages and founding moments. They were not searching for truth alone. They were searching for reassurance. Because once humans rule themselves, there is no higher court of appeal. Mistakes cannot be undone by prayer alone. Failure cannot be blamed upward forever. At some point, accountability settles inward. And inward accountability is heavy. So cultures wrap their systems in reverence, not to deceive, but to endure. Reverence slowed change. It softened conflict. It made obedience feel meaningful rather than imposed. In this way, the sacred survived not as command, but as glue. Even when empires fell, this glue held fragments together. New rulers inherited old languages of legitimacy. New laws echoed ancient phrasing. New institutions wore old symbols. Continuity was preserved even when power shifted. This is why history rarely feels like a series of breaks to those living inside it. It feels like persistence. The world changes shape, but the ground feels familiar. And familiarity is what allows people to sleep at night, even under systems they did not choose. As centuries passed, divine figures became increasingly abstract. They represented justice, order, fate, time. They moved from the center of governance into the center of meaning. They were no longer responsible for outcomes, but for interpretation. And interpretation became personal. Where once divine decree explained everything, now humans explain themselves. This transition is subtle but profound. It marks the point where societies begin to tolerate ambiguity without collapse. Where uncertainty no longer demands cosmic explanation. Where the world can be imperfect without being condemned. This tolerance is not natural. It is learned. And it was learned slowly, over generations of adaptation. Each law applied without divine consultation. Each dispute resolved by human judgment. Each crisis survived through planning rather than prayer alone. Each success attributed to preparation rather than miracle. Little by little, the balance shifted. Until one day, no one noticed it had shifted at all. And this is perhaps the quietest truth of all. That the greatest human achievement may not be domination, or discovery, or invention, but the ability to carry uncertainty without surrendering order. To live in a world without guarantees, and still build. To rule without absolute authority, and still govern. To act without perfect knowledge, and still decide. This capacity did not arrive with philosophy. It arrived with practice, with repetition, with time. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. Even when people longed for certainty, they could not return to dependence. The systems they had built required participation. The institutions they maintained demanded responsibility. The world no longer waited for instruction. It moved forward because humans moved it. And so, as the final minutes drift towards stillness, the story becomes less about the past and more about the rhythm that continues quietly into the present. A rhythm of maintenance, of memory, of inherited structure. The ancient temples may stand in ruins, but their logic survives in archives, courts, administrations, and expectations. The divine councils may have faded into story, but their insistence on legitimacy remains embedded in how power is judged. Even now, when authority feels unjust, people do not only resist it, they question its right to exist. That question is ancient. It echoes from a time when power had to be authorized by something higher. And when authority feels stable, people accept it not only because it works, but because it feels anchored. That feeling, too, is ancient. So the world continues, balanced between memory and function, between meaning and mechanism, between past and present. And nothing needs to be resolved. The story does not demand belief or disbelief. It only offers recognition. That long before modern states, long before written constitutions, long before theories of sovereignty, humanity underwent a transformation so deep that it reshaped reality itself quietly, patiently, without announcement. A world once governed from above became a world governed from within. And once that happened, sleep became possible in a different way. Not because the gods were watching, but because systems endure. And endurance, when it holds, allows rest. So let the final thought soften without conclusion. No lesson needs to be extracted. No argument needs to be won. The transfer is complete. The memory remains. The night is steady. And the mind, having traced the long arc of quiet change, can finally let go. Nothing more is required. Only rest. And now, as the story reaches its natural stillness, nothing more needs to be added. Because everything essential has already happened. Humans did not suddenly become different when civilization appeared. They did not wake up smarter, deeper, or more complete. They were already fully human long before cities, writing, or states existed. Civilization simply reorganized how that humanity expressed itself. For tens of thousands of years, people lived through memory, trust, shared meaning, and direct relationships. They built lives without monuments, governed themselves without laws written in stone, and carried knowledge not in archives, but in minds, voices, and ritual. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the structure changed. Memory moved into records. Trust moved into institutions. Meaning moved into systems. What had once lived between people began to live in buildings, laws, and procedures. Nothing was lost all at once. Nothing was gained all at once. It was not a revolution, but an adjustment, a long experiment in scale. Civilization made some things possible that had never existed before. It also made some things rare that had once been normal. Neither state is complete on its own. Both are human. And that is the quiet truth beneath this entire story. There was no moment when humans became human. There was only a long moment when humans learned to live differently. The ancient world did not vanish. It became background. Its logic still shapes how we expect authority to feel, how we seek meaning and order, how we react to chaos and stability. Those echoes remain, even now, and you do not need to hold them. You can let them rest. The fires have gone out. The camps have moved on. The cities sleep. The systems continue quietly. And the long human story, stretching far beyond memory and record, carries on without effort. Nothing more needs to be understood. Nothing more needs to be decided. The past has already done its work. And sleep, like history, arrives not suddenly but gently.